Halo 5 Guardians. When you hear the name of this Halo title, what comes to mind? What feelings does it bring to light? Interestingly enough, if you ask enough people, you'll get a wide range of answers spanning from great all the way to abomination. It's easily one of the most divisive Halo titles to be released, and today I'd like to dive further into it and why it ranks so high on my list of Halo games despite its major flaws. Now, before I continue, I have to remind folks that these are just my opinions. You don't have to agree with me, and I'm expecting many of you not to. I do ask, however, that we try to keep things civil and keep the conversation going. Yes, I realize that asking people to be civil on the internet is like asking a cat to behave, but I do genuinely want to hear well thought out comments and opinions in the comment section below. So, before we get to the good, we do have to address the elephant in the room, and that is the disaster of a launch the game really was. We'll get into the campaign itself in a bit, but for now, let's talk about the game when it launched, as it's quite different from what it is today. A bare-bones release may be the least insulting thing I can say about the state of the game back in 2015. The campaign itself had a lot of major issues, and this might be something that could be at least slightly glossed over if the game had a lot more to offer. Instead, the only other thing we had to entertain ourselves was the multiplayer, including Warzone. No Forge, no firefight, no firefight equivalent, no Spartan Ops, no nothing. This is easily the most lackluster release since the days before Halo 3, which again wouldn't be so bad if the campaign had knocked it out of the park. Instead, we were given a lackluster story with barely any time spent with the Master Chief on his own personal journey. And with that, let's talk about the campaign. To be blunt, it sounds like they were trying to go the Terminator Genesis route. Lots of ideas that could have easily spanned multiple media releases, but instead were crammed all into one disjointed title. The first mission alone is a head-scratcher. After a cutscene that seemed like it was ripped straight from Avengers Age of Ultron, we find ourselves on Kamchatka in pursuit of Dr. Catherine Halsey and her captor, Jul 'Mdama. If you're lost as to why we're here at all, I can't say that I blame you. I guess this mission was meant to serve as a conclusion to the Spartan Ops campaign, but it's just so stupidly wrong in every fashion, it boggles the mind. First off, we're playing as Fireteam Osiris, and unless you've read the books and watched the movie Nightfall, you're going to be completely lost as to who any of these characters are, with maybe the exception of Edward Buck, who is now currently a Spartan rather than an ODST. Other than that, we're really given no backstory on who these characters are and why we're playing as them for this mission instead of the Master Chief, icon of the series. We feel absolutely no connection to these characters, and the one character we might be able to empathize with is playing second fiddle to Luke Cage. Once the mission concludes, we kill Jul 'Mdama, the current supreme leader of the Covenant, in an anticlimactic cutscene and save the Doctor. That's right, the big bad goes down in the first mission. The sad thing is, this really could have been the main antagonist for the game. The Covenant have been the main nemesis for the UNSC since Game 1. And being on the hunt for him along with Halsey as the Master Chief would have been a great plot worthy of a two-parter. Instead, he goes down in Mission 1. What really bugs me here is that this mission really doesn't connect with the rest of the game. Why is anyone on Kamchatka to begin with? Why is Halsey there? Why are the Prometheans attacking? As far as we know, there's no Guardian on the planet, or at least if there is, it's never mentioned. So what's the point? The next mission, where we finally get to play as the Master Chief, is even more distant from the main plot of the overall campaign. We find ourselves on an abandoned space station called Argent Moon, where we have to fend off its assets from the Covenant. So what happens? We end up blowing up this space station as well as all its experimental ships, and it's never mentioned again, not once. The one important plot device that happens here is that Master Chief has some sort of magical vision of Cortana still being alive and decides to go find her, which seems very uncharacteristic for our hero-in-chief. Okay, whatever. Poor start to the game, but the next mission is where the plot actually begins to unfold when we travel to the rather ugly world of Meridian. Only it's not with the Master Chief, but rather with Fireteam Osiris. And for the next several missions, you'll only be fighting against Prometheans. There is no Covenant anywhere to be found. In the middle of these missions, things finally come to a head between the Master Chief and Spartan Locke via a Spartan catfight, presented in a cutscene. It's here where I need to veer off for a moment and address the marketing of the game, which focused heavily on the rivalry between these two Spartans. This was the buildup that many Halo fans had been waiting for, yet after all that hype, this is what we got. A brief CGI battle between the two Spartans before they kiss and make up later in the game over one of the most questionable things 343 has done in the lore of Halo: make Cortana the bad guy. It doesn't make much sense either, given that the main antagonist we fight multiple times throughout the campaign is Ultron impersonator the Warden Eternal. Yet somehow we find out that it's all just a ruse. He's actually some sort of bodyguard for Cortana, a frenemy, if you will, and Cortana is the one controlling all the Guardians. And when do we find all this out? The second to last mission in the game. It's also worth noting here that this is the Master Chief's third and final mission in the entire game. 3 out of 15 missions. Both Master Chief and Blue Team deserve better than that. Unless you've paid attention to the outside lore, we have no idea where Blue Team has been all this time, and where they were while the Master Chief was busy being the big hero in the original Halo trilogy. None of this is explained in-game. We do get a brief moment of exposition telling us that Blue Team grew up together, but in my opinion, this raises more questions than answers. The game also manages to shoehorn the Arbiter into the campaign. You remember that guy, right? Sure. We haven't heard from him since Halo 3, but why not? Why not add even more characters to this overcrowded cast? That's right, there are nearly 20 different main characters in this game, and we barely have time to get to know any of them or their motivations. And then when things finally start to get interesting with the Cortana dynamic, the game comes to a screeching to-be-continued halt. This may very well be the most undeserving to-be-continued in the history of video games. Contrast this with Halo 2's epic story and excellent character development, and Halo 5 just completely falls flat. The Arbiter's journey in Halo 2 is nothing short of a masterpiece, as he goes from human-hating genocidal general to ultimately siding with the humans to stop galactic annihilation. The Arbiter from Halo 2 is a memorable character that we'll remember for ages. Spartan Locke is not. Plain and simple. Locke is no different at the end of the game than he was at the beginning. This is not character development, it's lazy writing at its finest. What would I have done differently? Divide Halo 5 into 2 separate games, Halo 5 and Halo 5 Guardians. Halo 5 would have featured the Master Chief reuniting with the rest of Blue Team on their quest to save Dr. Halsey from Jewel Abdama. Their journey would have ultimately taken them to the planet Genesis, where ultimately they discover that Cortana is in fact very much still alive. End the game on that note and pick up with Fireteam Osiris in Halo 5 Guardians, where the Forerunner events and the rise of the Guardians become the central plot. The missions would play largely out the same, save for the fight between Chief and Locke, and the to-be-continued would feel more earned rather than wasted. So I just spent all this time discussing what I hated about the game, yet it still ranks this high up in my list of favorite games. How could that possibly be? Well, this goes back to what I said in previous videos. If I were ranking these games solely based on the story element, the list would be very different. Halo 5 would be dead last without question. But a good story is not what I look for in a good video game. Sure, it's always a massive bonus to have a story that's both compelling and intriguing, but it's not the defining factor for me. This goes back to the classic days of iconic games like Super Mario Bros. And the original Zelda. Sure, there's technically a story there, but it's pretty straightforward. Fight monsters, save the princess, and call it a day. That's basically it. Yet for me, despite there not being much story to tell, I still rate Super Mario Bros. 3 as one of my favorite games of all time. In short, you don't need to have a great story to have a great video game. I'd rather have a game with satisfying gameplay with a lackluster story than a game with a first-rate story but crappy gameplay. You might feel differently about that, and that's totally cool. That's your right, and you should feel free to own it. But for me, the gameplay matters more, and for me, this is where Halo 5 starts to shine. Let's start with the squad system. While the AI could have been certainly better, I love this never play alone direction that Microsoft seems to be going. One of the first main things that attracted me to the original Halo game was being able to fight alongside a squad of Marines. Granted, you couldn't do this all the time, resulting in eerie missions like the library, But I still have fond memories charging up the beach of the Silent Cartographer, or boarding the Truth and Reconciliation for the first time with my own personal squad of funny and charismatic Marines. To me, that's a major highlight of the squad system, always having a team there to support you no matter how dire the situation becomes. Again, the squad system needs improvement, and in the future, I'd like the ability to choose my own squad mates, but I get what they're going for here, and I can appreciate it at least for that. The ability to direct your team to pick up certain weapons, attack certain enemies, and even revive you in combat, I think also adds a new and entertaining dynamic to the game, and admittedly, it's one that I miss when playing previous Halo titles. I don't expect everyone to feel this way, but at least for me, it added a certain depth to the strategies that I used on the battlefield. Now let's talk about the major elephant in the room, the one that seems to divide the community the most: enhanced mobility. In previous videos, I've noted that Halo Reach was the first Halo game to really kick off this trend with the inclusion of armor abilities. This had very mixed reactions from the Halo community, especially with the addition of armor lock. Still, this would be a concept that would carry over into Halo 4. For me at least, the armor abilities in Halo 4 felt more organic to the gameplay, but at the same time, they still felt rather jarring on the battlefield, particularly in multiplayer with the addition of loadouts. Sprint was no longer bound by a particular armor ability, but rather became a core feature. Again, the concept of Sprint is one I could take or leave. With many modern first-person shooters adopting the concept, at least to some extent it made sense to include it in some way, shape, or form in Halo. Like with the squad concept, I found myself at least partially missing this when playing older Halo titles. I'm not saying it's better, but I am saying that it gives the player more options when it comes to how you operate on the battlefield. In Halo 5, Sprint became infinite rather than based on a timer. If I had to choose between Sprint with or without a timer, it would be without. It's one less thing I have to worry about when I'm on the go. And this brings us to the fact that Halo 5 nixed armor abilities entirely in place of enhanced mobility. Multiplayer was back to fresh, even start, so even if you're one who prefers zero enhanced mobility, at the very least you no longer had to worry about that special and unique armor ability that your opponent had up his or her sleeve. What I like about the remaining enhanced mobilities is the ideology of promoting vertical gameplay in addition to horizontal, adding a brand new dynamic to the battlefield without the use of jetpacks. This is where missions like Swords of Sanghelios tend to shine, as they are specifically designed with these ideas in mind. If I had to give any major credit to the campaign, it's the sheer size of the missions in which you play. Sure, they're still fairly linear compared to some of the missions from the original Halo, but they still give you numerous options on how you can get from point A to point B. For me at least, that promotes replayability, which in turn gives the game more longevity. I still understand why there's a major pushback on enhanced mobility though. If you're asking me if I can play Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 5 and say they feel the same, I can tell you outright that they don't. Not even remotely close. But I also can't say that the mechanics from either game are necessarily better than the other. The mechanics of each respective game fits the tone in which they were designed. Halo CE wouldn't work with enhanced mobility, whereas Halo 5 wouldn't really work well without it. They're two completely different games with two completely different styles of gameplay. When I look back on all the Halo titles, it's interesting to see how each game has evolved or changed from the previous one. Halo 2, for example, added both dual wielding as well as vehicle hijacking. Halo 3 added equipment. Halo Reach added armor abilities. Halo 4 added permanent sprint, and Halo 5 added infinite sprint while also swapping out armor abilities for enhanced mobility. Each game has evolved in some way from its predecessor, even though some changes have been more jarring than others. So in some ways I understand why so many people dislike the modern take on Halo. Does it feel like the original? Well, no, but that's the thing. If I'm in the mood for playing Halo with its original mechanics, I still can. I can start up Halo 3 or Halo 3 in the Master Chief Collection and play Halo the way I remember it. Halo 5 is a different game, and I expect it to be different rather than just be a carbon copy of the games that came before it. Those older games will still be there if I want to play them, as will be Halo 5. I personally like a little variety in my gameplay experiences. Speaking of variety, let's shift away from enhanced mobility and revisit some of the other aspects of the campaign, more specifically the Prometheans. If you remember what I said about them in Halo 4, you'll note that my memories of them were far from fond. The crawlers seem to slow the game down to a grinding halt, much like the drones in earlier Halo titles. The Watchers were annoying as hell, and the Knights were way too overpowered, even able to take down Hunters. So how do the Prometheans fare at Halo 5? Surprisingly, they're much more fleshed out and balanced, which is a good thing considering how often we fight against them. The crawlers this time around don't appear in mass so much as scattered cannon fodder, similar to grunts and jackals of the Covenant, at least in most instances. The Watchers have been scaled back to less powerful aerial support units, which is how I always pictured the drones, or at least how I thought the drones should have been in previous Halo titles, and the Knights have been made significantly less powerful. They can no longer teleport, their special abilities have been scaled back, they appear far less often, and now they have weak spots to make them easier to kill. But the major standout here is the latest addition of the Promethean ranks, the Promethean Soldier. There's now a middleman ranking system between the crawlers and the Knights that comes off as being somewhat of a combination of the Covenant Jackal and the Elite. While I'll openly admit that their phase teleporting gets old real fast, it is admittedly a decent middle ground for the Promethean forces. I also appreciate how they've tweaked some of the Promethean weapons this time around. Both the bolt shot and the suppressor now have added tracking to their projectiles, making them stand out more from their other in-game counterparts. The binary rifle now feels more like the focus rifle from Halo Reach rather than just another run-of-the-mill sniper rifle, and the incineration cannon now has two separate firing modes, one of which has mortar capabilities similar to the fuel rod cannon from Halo PC. However, I personally think that the multiplayer and Forge were the two things to see the most improvement. I'm a big fan of both Warzone and Warzone Firefight in general. I love the ideology of not only having up to 24 players on the battlefield all at once, but also having the addition of AI objectives is a total blast, and something I've wanted since Halo Combat Evolved. Combined with the 60 frames per second, this is the most fun I've had in Halo multiplayer since Halo 3, and that's saying something. Forge mode is quite an accomplishment too. While I do have to take points off for waiting an entire year to introduce it to the game, the customization options are near limitless, and Forge crafters can now recreate all of their old favorite Halo maps from the ground up with a level of detail we have yet to see with any other major Halo title. So at the end of the day, what does all this mean? Is Halo 5 perfect? No, not by a long shot. But I do consider it to be a vast improvement over what came before it in terms of 343's Halo titles. The campaign story is a major setback. It's easily the worst story I've encountered out of all the Halo games, period. And that's just depressing, especially considering that Halo in general is typically known for its strong storytelling and memorable characters. They definitely tried to borrow elements from Halo 2, but they borrowed all the wrong elements. Halo 2 had one of the best stories, if not the best story in the entire franchise. Had they looked closer at what made the story of Halo 2 so epic in the first place, Halo 5 might rank higher on this list. But regardless of how bad the story is, the gameplay, at least to me, is pretty solid. I'm glad armor abilities are now a thing of the past with Halo 5, and I realize that there are a lot of people out there that disagree with me when it comes to enhanced mobility, but I also get why it's there. It's an attempt to bring Halo into the modern world of FPS. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing is completely up to you. While I agree that it feels vastly different than what we all know and love from the original Halo trilogy, I still prefer the current iteration to armor abilities. But again, that's just my own personal opinion. Warzone is also a complete and total blast, and Forge mode allows for almost unlimited potential when it comes to creativity and map design. For that, I have to say that for me, Halo 5 Guardians in its current state is worth buying at full price. I'm not going to talk about microtransactions much since they don't really particularly affect my personal gameplay of Halo 5 Guardians, but I will say in terms of unlocking armor, microtransactions are not the best way to do it. In my personal opinion, Halo Reach had the best unlocking system for armor, and to me, future Halo titles should adopt that system instead of using microtransactions to try to make more money off of players for unlocking the armor that they want. My hope for the future is that 343 doesn't release half a game, then wait a year before they finish it. First impressions are important, and I can easily see why so many people were initially turned off by this game. But at least for me, Halo 5 in its current form is pretty darn impressive, and I'd love to hear what you all think about Halo 5 and why you either like it or don't like it. I hope today I was able to shed some light as to why I personally like Halo 5 Guardians, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. And I'd like to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy day to sit down and watch this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope you'll consider subscribing for more great content right here on MythicTyrant.com. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope all of you have an absolutely wonderful week. I'll catch you all right back here next time, and as always, I'm the Tyrant, signing off.